Imagine fighting an enemy so wealthy in resources that what they abandon in retreat equals more than your entire army receives in a month. In February 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps captured an American supply dump at Kasserine Pass that contained 57,000 gallons of fuel, more than German divisions were allocated monthly from Europe. What seemed like a tactical victory revealed a brutal truth. Germany could never match America's industrial power. By early 1943, the deserts of North Africa had already consumed hundreds of thousands of soldiers from Britain, Germany, Italy, and now the United States. For 2 years, the North African theater had been a seesaw of victories and defeats, shaped not only by battlefield courage, but by the brutal realities of logistics, supply lines, and industrial production. The upcoming battle at Kasserine Pass would not simply be a clash of armies. It would become a lesson in the mathematics of modern war. When the Afrika Korps, under the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, first landed in North Africa in early 1941, their presence was intended as a limited reinforcement to the struggling Italian army. Hitler had not envisioned a massive German commitment. Yet by 1942, Rommel's forces were fighting some of the most critical battles of the war, from Tobruk to El Alamein, stretching German resources far beyond their original intent. The problem, as always for Germany, was fuel. Every panzer, every truck, every aircraft required fuel that had to be shipped across the Mediterranean in convoys constantly harassed by British submarines and aircraft. Even at their best, German divisions in Africa often received only a fraction of their requested fuel allocations. A panzer division might be assigned 50,000 gallons per month on paper, but in reality they might receive only 15,000 to 20,000 after British sinkings and logistical delays. The result was a constant state of fuel starvation that limited operations, forced tanks to be abandoned, and left Rommel perpetually on the defensive, even after battlefield victories. By late 1942, the situation had worsened dramatically. Operation Torch had brought the Americans into the war in North Africa, landing forces in Morocco and Algeria. Suddenly, the Afrika Korps faced not only the British Eighth Army under Montgomery advancing from the east, but also a new Anglo-American force pressing from the west. It was only a matter of time before these forces converged. The German High Command, fully aware that North Africa was a secondary theater, continued to starve Rommel of reinforcements and supplies. Hitler's strategic focus had shifted decisively to the Eastern Front, where the Battle of Stalingrad had just ended in catastrophic German defeat. Yet Rommel, the Desert Fox, was ordered to continue resisting in Africa, tying down Allied forces for as long as possible. It was under these circumstances that the Americans, still inexperienced and untested in large-scale desert warfare, marched eastward into Tunisia in early 1943. Their generals, including Major General Lloyd Fredendall of II Corps, had never commanded large armies in combat. Their troops were brave but green, lacking the discipline and tactical finesse honed by years of war. In contrast, the Afrika Korps and its Italian allies, though exhausted and undersupplied, were veterans of countless battles, masters of desert warfare, and commanded by some of the most capable officers of the Wehrmacht. The stage was thus set for a confrontation at Kasserine Pass, a narrow defile in the Atlas Mountains of central Tunisia. Here, Rommel saw his chance. He could not hope to defeat the Allies strategically. He lacked the resources for that. But he could deliver a sharp tactical blow, shattering American morale and buying time for Axis forces to consolidate. The Americans had established defensive positions around the passes, but were spread thin. Their supply dumps, hastily constructed and poorly guarded, contained enormous quantities of fuel, food, ammunition, and vehicles. Unlike the Germans, who measured every drop of gasoline, the Americans brought fuel in such abundance that they could afford to stockpile it in forward depots. To Rommel, this seemed both reckless and an opportunity. Colonel Hans Georg Hildebrandt of the 21st Panzer Division was among those who prepared to strike. A seasoned officer, Hildebrandt had fought across North Africa and understood the crippling constraints of supply shortages. When he looked at his division's fuel ledger, the numbers were grim. Barely enough fuel to mount limited operations, certainly not enough for a sustained offensive. His tanks often sat idle, waiting for a handful of fuel trucks to arrive. What neither Hildebrandt nor Rommel could have fully anticipated was the sheer scale of what they were about to capture. On paper, the American supply depots contained more fuel than Hildebrandt's division would see in several months. To men accustomed to eking out every gallon, the sight of thousands of fuel drums would be nothing short of surreal. The coming battle was not inevitable. It was shaped by choices. Fredendall, the American Corps commander, dispersed his forces into small, isolated detachments instead of concentrating them. He placed his headquarters dozens of miles to the rear, operating from a bunker so distant that he could barely observe the battlefield. Rommel, recognizing his opponent's inexperience, moved swiftly to exploit it. The Germans advanced on February 14, 1943. Hildebrandt's 21st Panzer Division, alongside elements of the 10th Panzer Division and Italian Centauro Division, drove into American positions with devastating effect. The green U.S. troops, unprepared for the speed and precision of a German armored assault, fell back in disorder. Tanks were abandoned, artillery pieces left behind, and supply depots overrun. As the Afrika Korps poured through the pass, Hildebrandt's men came upon the first of the American supply dumps. What they found stunned them. There were rows upon rows of fuel drums, tens of thousands of gallons, stacked carelessly in the desert sun. Alongside them were crates of food, ammunition, spare parts, and even luxuries that German soldiers had not seen in years: chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, canned fruit. To the fuel-starved Germans, the sight was both exhilarating and deeply demoralizing. On February 17th, Hildebrandt's division reported the capture of at least 57,000 gallons of fuel in a single depot, not counting the hundreds of vehicles and tanks seized intact. For comparison, his monthly allocation from Germany was often less than 20,000 gallons. In other words, in one American depot abandoned in haste, he had captured more than 2 or 3 months' worth of his division's fuel allotment. This moment revealed the fundamental imbalance of the war. The United States, with its vast oil reserves and industrial capacity, could afford to lose what Germany could not hope to supply in the first place. To the German soldiers, it felt as though the Americans had casually abandoned riches beyond measure. For Rommel, this windfall was both a blessing and a curse. The fuel would power his immediate operations, allowing the Afrika Korps to continue advancing. Yet he also understood what it implied. If the Americans could stockpile and then abandon such enormous quantities, their reserves must be almost limitless. Germany, by contrast, was scraping the bottom of its barrel. The capture of the American supply dumps at Kasserine Pass thus became more than just a tactical victory. It was a glimpse into the industrial realities of the war, a reminder that while Germany could still outfight its enemies on the battlefield, it could never outproduce them. As Rommel himself later reflected, the victory at Kasserine was hollow. The supplies captured would delay defeat, not prevent it. And for officers like Hildebrandt, the sight of abandoned American fuel was a revelation. The Reich was fighting a war it could not win. After the bitter defeat at El Alamein in late 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel knew the strategic tide in North Africa had turned. His Afrika Korps, exhausted and undersupplied, had been driven back across Libya into Tunisia by Montgomery's British Eighth Army. Yet Rommel was not finished. In February 1943, with the Allies still organizing their newly landed American forces, Rommel saw a fleeting opportunity for one last offensive blow. The Allied landings in Operation Torch had brought fresh American troops into the theater, but their presence was a mixed blessing. Though numerically strong, the U.S. Army was inexperienced. Its senior commanders were new to the art of desert warfare, its units untested against a skilled enemy, and its logistical planning careless. Rommel recognized this vulnerability. He could not destroy the Allies strategically. They had the advantage of numbers, resources, and supply. But perhaps he could smash the Americans tactically, damaging their morale, delaying their advance, and buying precious time for the Axis. Rommel's plan in February 1943 was bold yet desperate. He intended to strike at the weakly held passes of the Atlas Mountains, particularly at Kasserine and Spaiba. By doing so, he hoped to break through into the Allied rear, disrupt their lines of communication, and perhaps even drive them back toward Algeria. Success might force the Allies into a defensive posture, relieving pressure on his battered forces facing Montgomery in the east. The Afrika Korps, however, was in no condition for sustained operations. Rommel's divisions were short on fuel, spare parts, and ammunition. The 21st and 10th Panzer Divisions, his principal striking forces, were shadows of their former strength. Many tanks were immobilized for lack of fuel, while others lacked replacement parts. His Italian allies of the Centauro Division were brave but under-equipped. Every move Rommel made had to be calculated carefully, with the knowledge that fuel shortages might strand his forces in the middle of battle. Despite these problems, Rommel pressed ahead. He was, above all, a gambler. He believed the Americans' inexperience and Fredendall's poor leadership could be exploited. If the attack succeeded, it might give Germany leverage in negotiations with Mussolini and Hitler, who were already considering whether to abandon North Africa altogether. The American situation. On the Allied side, Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded 2 corps, which had been assigned to guard the passes of the Atlas Mountains. Fredendall was a curious figure. Unlike Patton or Montgomery, he preferred to command from far behind the front lines, operating out of a bunker dug into a mountain nearly 70 miles from the fighting. His orders were often vague, his deployments scattered, and his confidence in his own men limited. Fredendall dispersed his divisions into small, isolated strongpoints, rather than concentrating them in force. This decision left the Americans vulnerable to piecemeal defeat. Moreover, many of his units were green. The 1st Armored Division, for instance, had modern equipment but little battlefield experience. The infantry units, too, were unfamiliar with desert conditions and German tactics. Most dangerously, the Americans' logistical discipline was poor. Supply dumps were established close to the front lines, inadequately guarded, and often without camouflage. The U.S. Army, flush with resources, did not yet understand that their enemy, starved of fuel and supplies, viewed every drum of gasoline as precious. To the Germans, American carelessness would appear almost criminal. The attack begins. On February 14, 1943, Rommel struck. The attack began at Fade Pass, east of Kasserine, where the 21st Panzer Division and elements of the 10th Panzer smashed into U.S. forces. American units, caught by surprise, collapsed under the pressure. Entire battalions disintegrated, tanks were abandoned, and supply depots left undefended. Within hours, the Germans had driven a wedge through the American lines. As Rommel's spearheads advanced, Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt and the 21st Panzer Division pushed westward. The Americans resisted bravely in places, but the speed and precision of the German armored assault overwhelmed them. Hildebrandt's men were veterans, accustomed to the desert, skilled in combined arms tactics. The Americans, in contrast, often reacted too slowly, failed to coordinate armor and infantry, and left artillery unsupported. By February 16th, the Germans had advanced toward Kasserine Pass itself, a narrow gap between 2 mountain ranges that offered the only major route through the Atlas. Holding this pass was vital for the Americans. Losing it meant opening the road into their rear. Yet Fredendall's deployments had left the defenders stretched thin, with little reserve to counterattack. The capture of supplies. It was during this advance that Hildebrandt's troops overran one of the largest American supply dumps in the sector. Reports from German officers described the scene vividly. Thousands of fuel drums stacked in the open, alongside hundreds of crates of food, ammunition, and spare parts. Parked vehicles stood abandoned, many with their keys still in the ignition. Some tanks had been left intact, their crews fleeing in panic. The numbers were staggering. In just one depot, the Germans seized 57,000 gallons of fuel, nearly 3 times what a panzer division might receive in a month from German supply lines. They also captured 183 tanks and over 500 vehicles, not all operational, but many reparable. For soldiers who had struggled for months with crippling shortages, the sight was surreal. One German soldier later recalled his amazement. The Americans left behind more fuel in one place than we had seen in months. We did not understand how they could abandon it so easily. For Hildebrandt, the captured supplies were a godsend. His tanks, which often had to ration every gallon, could now move freely. Trucks could carry ammunition and food without fear of running dry. For a few days, The Afrika Korps felt what it was like to fight without logistical chains tightening around their neck. The strategic realization. Yet even as they rejoiced, the German officers understood the darker meaning of what they had found. If the Americans could afford to abandon such vast quantities, what did that say about their overall resources? For Germany, every drop of fuel had to cross the Mediterranean under constant threat of British attack. For America, oil came from Texas and Oklahoma in seemingly endless rivers. The captured depot was thus both a triumph and a revelation. Germany could still win battles, but it could not win the war. The math was unforgiving. America's oil production in 1943 alone exceeded Germany's by a factor of more than 50. Its factories produced more tanks and trucks in a single month than Germany could deliver in half a year. No matter how skillful the Afrika Korps, no matter how brilliant Rommel, the imbalance was insurmountable. Rommel himself, upon hearing the reports, understood this immediately. The supplies would sustain his offensive for days, perhaps weeks. But long-term, they proved that the enemy had resources so vast that tactical victories could not alter the strategic outcome. When Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt's 21st Panzer Division swept through the American lines at Kasserine, the victory was not measured in prisoners or destroyed tanks alone. For the German officers and soldiers who entered the captured American depots, the real shock lay in what they found stacked in neat rows and scattered across the desert floor. The scene of abundance. Imagine a German panzer crew that had been rationed to just a few gallons of fuel per day suddenly walking into a depot where 55-gallon drums of gasoline were piled like children's building blocks. Hundreds of drums, shimmering in the desert sun, stretched as far as the eye could see. Trucks stood abandoned with their tanks full. Tanks, some in pristine condition, sat waiting with little more than minor mechanical faults. For months, Hildebrandt's men had driven on fumes. They often halted not because the enemy had stopped them, but because their tanks had simply run out of fuel. Supply convoys from Italy were constantly harassed by Allied aircraft and submarines. One ship sunk in the Mediterranean could mean that entire battalions went without fuel or ammunition for weeks. Soldiers had grown accustomed to stripping disabled vehicles for spare parts, salvaging every bolt, every drop of oil, and even using captured British and American fuel cans to keep their machines moving. Now, here in the middle of Tunisia, they found themselves standing inside what looked like a treasure hoard. To them, it was as if the Americans had casually left the gates of paradise open. A German soldier's reaction. A diary entry from a German soldier in the 21st Panzer Division, later recovered by Allied intelligence, described the moment. "We came upon the enemy's supply area. I could not believe my eyes. Fuel, trucks, food, all abandoned. We filled our tanks until they overflowed. We drank American coffee, which I had never tasted before. It was sweet, strong, and plentiful. We joke that if the Americans fight as carelessly as they supply, then perhaps we can still win." The men laughed, but the humor masked a growing unease. They were professional soldiers, and they understood logistics. This much fuel and equipment, left behind so casually, was more than their division had seen in months. To abandon it must mean the Americans could replace it with ease. 57,000 gallons, the numbers. The figures from the captured depot stunned even Rommel when the reports reached him. At least 57,000 gallons of fuel were seized, along with 183 tanks and over 500 wheeled vehicles. For perspective, German divisions in North Africa often received fewer than 20,000 gallons per month when the supply convoys got through it all. One German quartermaster calculated that the captured fuel was equivalent to nearly 3 months of his division's normal ration. With that amount, the panzers could maneuver without the usual paralyzing caution. Suddenly, every commander had freedom of action. Engines could idle longer, units could redeploy faster, and tanks could pursue rather than merely defend. Yet the realization dawned quickly. This was not a sustainable windfall. The Germans had been handed a gift, but it only underscored the greater imbalance. If the Americans could abandon such quantities, how much more must they have waiting in Algeria or back across the Atlantic? Rommel's reaction. When Rommel visited the captured supply areas, he was at first delighted. His soldiers needed this badly, and the morale boost was obvious. They were jubilant, filling their bellies with captured rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, and coffee. They were patching up abandoned American vehicles and pressing them into service with German markings hastily painted on their sides. But Rommel, ever the realist, understood the strategic meaning. According to post-war accounts from his staff officers, Rommel remarked bitterly, "If the Americans can leave behind such treasures, it means they have more than they need. We may win here and there, but we cannot win against such a flood. It is impossible." That insight foreshadowed the outcome of the entire war. Germany could still win battles, but not the war. The war was becoming a test of industrial strength, and Rommel had just been given proof that America's industrial power was overwhelming. The food that shocked the Germans. Beyond fuel and equipment, the Americans had left behind something else that astonished the Germans: food. Crates of rations lay unopened. There were tins of Spam, cartons of cigarettes, instant coffee packets, chocolate, and even powdered milk. For men who had grown used to eating thin stews of barley or horse meat, the abundance was staggering. One German private, writing in his journal, recorded, "The enemy soldiers eat like kings. Even in their retreat, they leave behind more food than we can carry. I tasted chocolate today for the first time since I was a child." We laughed, but some men grew quiet. If America feeds its soldiers this way, what chance do we have? Our people at home are starving. The psychological effect was as important as the physical supplies. German soldiers realized that America's strength was not only in machines, but in its ability to feed and sustain its armies better than Germany could sustain its own people. The captured tanks. The Germans also captured dozens of American tanks, M3 Lees, M3 Stuarts, and some of the newer M4 Shermans. Many were damaged but reparable. German mechanics, adept at salvaging, quickly restored several to working order. Soon, American-made tanks, repainted with black crosses, were rumbling forward alongside panzers. The irony was not lost on the soldiers. Germany's armored divisions were now relying on captured enemy equipment, while America was producing tanks by the thousands each month. Every Sherman lost at Kasserine would be replaced in weeks, while every panzer lost was a blow that could not be undone. A strategic mirage. For a brief moment, the captured supplies gave the Germans an illusion of strength. Hildebrandt's division pressed forward with renewed vigor, fueled by American gasoline and riding in captured American vehicles. But beneath the surface, the truth was unavoidable. This was borrowed time. Even as Rommel's forces advanced, American logistics officers were already rerouting new supplies from Algeria. Ships carrying fuel, tanks, and ammunition were docking daily in Oran and Algiers, replenishing the losses at a pace Germany could not hope to match. What the Afrika Korps saw as a treasure trove was, to America, a minor setback, a speed bump on the road to inevitable victory. The lesson of logistics. The capture of the American supply dumps at Kasserine illustrated a critical lesson of modern war. Tactics win battles, but logistics wins wars. Rommel and Hildebrandt could win skirmishes, even shatter inexperienced armies. But they could not alter the arithmetic of industrial production. Germany's entire synthetic fuel production for 1943 amounted to just 3.5 million tons. The United States, by contrast, produced 184 million tons of crude oil that year, over 50 times as much. No amount of tactical brilliance could close that gap. The sudden windfall at Kasserine created a peculiar atmosphere within the Afrika Korps. For weeks, German and Italian soldiers had fought under the shadow of scarcity, rationing fuel by the liter, cannibalizing wrecks for parts, and eating whatever meager supplies managed to slip past Allied naval and air blockades. Now, with American fuel flowing into their jerrycans and American food filling their bellies, a dangerous illusion began to spread among the ranks. The temporary high. German soldiers, elated by their success, began to joke that perhaps the Americans were their best allies after all, since they seemed eager to provide the very supplies the Reich struggled to deliver. Captured trucks and jeeps were pressed into service. Cigarettes, once a rare luxury, were now so plentiful that German soldiers smoked them carelessly. Officers noticed the change in morale. For the first time in months, their men seemed relaxed, even overconfident. Around the campfires at night, talk turned not to worries about fuel shortages, but to fantasies of pushing the Americans back into the sea. The capture of the dumps had created a brief but intoxicating sense that victory in North Africa was still possible. Rommel's sobering analysis. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel saw through the illusion. He had commanded in the desert for nearly 2 years and understood logistics better than most generals. Though he welcomed the supplies, he recognized them as a fleeting gift. In his post-war writings, Rommel recalled his unease. The Americans had left behind more fuel in one place than we could bring across the Mediterranean in several weeks. At first, my men rejoiced. But to me, it was a grim sign. What they abandoned was more than we possessed. How could such abundance ever be defeated? Rommel understood what many of his officers ignored, that capturing enemy stockpiles was no substitute for secure supply lines. Germany's dependence on overstretched convoys from Italy meant that every ton of fuel was precious, every shipment vulnerable. America, by contrast, had entire oceans of oil, fleets of tankers, and a production system that could replace losses almost instantly. The harsh desert reality. Despite the windfall, German commanders quickly discovered the limits of their new resources. Transporting 57,000 gallons of fuel in the desert was no simple matter. Much of it had to be moved by truck, and even American vehicles guzzled enormous amounts just to haul the precious cargo. Some barrels leaked, others were damaged, and the searing desert heat caused evaporation losses. Within weeks, the miraculous surplus was already dwindling. The Afrika Korps had temporarily expanded its operational range, but each day of maneuvers drained the captured supply. It became clear that, no matter how large the American dumps seemed, they were not enough to sustain a prolonged offensive. The American response. Meanwhile, American logistics officers were already correcting their mistakes. Though the defeat at Kasserine stung, it provided invaluable lessons. The U.S. Army quickly reorganized its supply system in North Africa. Depots were moved further to the rear, guarded more effectively, and resupplied through convoys arriving at Algerian ports. The Americans also began instituting tighter discipline in field depots, ensuring that frontline units could not simply abandon massive stockpiles in a retreat. Within weeks, the gaps that had allowed Rommel's men to seize such abundance were closing. The U.S. Army, inexperienced at first, was learning fast. A soldier's realization. Accounts from German diaries reveal how the soldiers' initial euphoria slowly gave way to a more sobering perspective. One Panzer crewman wrote, "We live well today, better than we ever lived on German rations. But it cannot last. For every can of American gasoline we burn, they have 10 more across the sea. Our victories taste of ash, for they show us only how strong the enemy truly is." The recognition was spreading among the rank and file. They began to understand that what seemed like plundered riches were in fact crumbs from a table so vast they could scarcely imagine it. The illusion of tactical triumph. The Afrika Korps had dealt the Americans a humiliating tactical defeat at Kasserine. U.S. units had broken under pressure, leaving behind equipment and supplies. Newspapers in Berlin hailed it as proof of German superiority, boasting that inexperienced American troops were no match for the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. But within the Wehrmacht's own high command, the celebration was muted. Reports from North Africa carried an underlying message. While tactical success was possible, strategic victory was out of reach. Every ton of supplies captured at Kasserine was a reminder of what America could afford to lose, and what Germany could never hope to gain on its own. Lessons ignored. The Kasserine supply dumps revealed a truth that should have shaped German strategy. America's strength lay in production, not merely in numbers of men. But Nazi leadership, blinded by ideology, continued to underestimate the enemy. Hitler dismissed reports of American industrial output, insisting that Germany's superior soldiers would prevail. Rommel, however, had seen the evidence with his own eyes. He knew that the abundance at Kasserine was not a sign of German opportunity, but of American potential. It marked the beginning of the end for his Afrika Korps, even as his men cheered their temporary windfall. The Afrika Korps' capture of the Kasserine Pass supplied dumps highlighted in the starkest possible way the imbalance at the heart of the war: industrial production and logistical capacity. While Rommel's men marveled at the gallons of fuel, stacks of rations, and endless vehicles left behind, American officers back at Algiers and Oran were already drafting replacement orders. For the United States, the loss was inconvenient. For Germany, the same amount would have been a lifeline. The numbers behind the war. By early 1943, the United States had achieved an unprecedented mobilization of its industrial base. American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year, tens of thousands of tanks, and millions of tons of shipping. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan alone was completing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, each containing 1.5 million parts. By contrast, German production remained constrained by Allied bombing, limited access to raw materials, and Hitler's insistence on diverting resources into experimental wonder weapons rather than proven designs. North Africa in particular was strangled by geography. Everything from fuel to bullets had to cross the Mediterranean under constant threat from Allied aircraft and submarines. In pure numbers, the disparity was insurmountable. At Kasserine, the Afrika Korps seized 57,000 gallons of fuel. At the same time, American oil companies back home were pumping millions of barrels per day. The ratio was so extreme that what seemed like a miracle to Rommel was hardly a rounding error in Washington. The German supply crisis. German records from the period reveal the near-desperate state of their supply system. A panzer division in North Africa typically required 400 to 500 tons of supplies per day to operate effectively. Fuel alone consumed a massive share, with each tank requiring hundreds of liters for even short advances. Yet convoys from Italy could rarely deliver more than a fraction of this demand, and Allied attacks steadily increased losses. One German logistics officer described the situation in a letter home. "Every liter of fuel must be fought for. We siphon it from wrecks, beg it from the Italians, and still it vanishes faster than we can use it. When I saw the American fuel dumps, I understood. They waste more than we ever possess." Even after the capture at Kasserine, German commanders were forced to ration carefully. Tanks were limited in their maneuvers, aircraft grounded due to lack of aviation fuel, and supply trucks had to be prioritized for essentials. The very abundance of captured American stockpiles only emphasized how dependent the Afrika Korps remained on chance windfalls. America's redundant strength. The United States not only produced in quantity, but also built redundancy into its logistics. Supplies flowed through multiple ports, Algiers, Oran, Casablanca, and were transported on newly built trucks along rapidly expanding road networks. If one depot was lost, another could replace it within weeks. German intelligence reports intercepted later in the war confirmed this pattern. American losses in material were offset so quickly that Axis commanders often complained that destroying enemy stockpiles was futile. One Italian officer in Tunisia observed bitterly, "The Americans fight with two armies, the one in front of us, and the one waiting in their factories." The lesson of mathematics. For Rommel, who prided himself on bold maneuvers and tactical brilliance, the lesson was difficult but undeniable. Battles could be won on skill and courage, but wars were determined by arithmetic. If Germany lost one tank for every American tank destroyed, the Americans would still come out ahead because they could replace their losses tenfold. This mathematical certainty gnawed at him. The capture of fuel and vehicles at Kasserine bought him time, but it also confirmed his deepest fear, that the enemy could afford to lose more in one battle than Germany could replace in an entire campaign. The beginning of strategic despair. By late February 1943, as the Afrika Korps regrouped, the reality was sinking in. Even the most optimistic German officers understood that no matter how skillfully they fought, the supply equation was impossible to balance. What had begun as a daring desert campaign had transformed into a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Kasserine had been a victory on the battlefield, but it was also a revelation. The abandoned American stockpiles demonstrated that the United States fought on a scale far beyond Germany's comprehension. To Rommel and his men, it was as if they had peered into the future and seen the inevitability of defeat written in gallons of gasoline and tons of rations. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was celebrated in German reports as a stunning triumph. Rommel's forces, particularly Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt's 21st Panzer Division, had broken through inexperienced American lines, captured hundreds of vehicles, and overran supply depots brimming with food, ammunition, and fuel. For frontline soldiers, it was a moment of exhilaration. They had humbled the new enemy, taken spoils on a scale rarely seen in North Africa, and temporarily regained the initiative. The illusion of success. Yet beneath the cheers and propaganda lay an uncomfortable truth. The material captured at Kasserine far exceeded what German supply officers considered normal allocations. The 183 tanks, 512 vehicles, and 57,000 gallons of fuel abandoned by the retreating Americans represented not just a battlefield prize, but a mirror reflecting Germany's strategic weakness. For the Americans, this was a logistical mishap, the result of green troops being caught unprepared and supply depots being placed too close to the front. Within weeks, replacements had been shipped from ports in Algeria and Morocco. By March, new tanks and fuel stocks had already erased the losses. For Germany, however, capturing such treasure was the only way to keep fighting. Rommel's calculated use of the spoils. Rommel understood better than anyone that he had only borrowed strength from his enemy. The fuel allowed his panzers to maneuver aggressively for a short time, pushing deeper against American positions and forcing them to retreat. But every advance consumed the very fuel they had just seized. Within days, the captured reserves were nearly gone, siphoned into tank engines, supply trucks, and aircraft. The irony was painful. The more aggressively the Afrika Korps used its newfound bounty, the faster it vanished. The Germans could win a battle with captured supplies, but they could not win a war. American adaptation. Unlike the Germans, the Americans learned quickly from failure. The defeat at Kasserine embarrassed U.S. commanders and shocked Washington. General Dwight Eisenhower immediately ordered changes. Reorganization of command structure so that American forces no longer operated in fragmented units. Rapid retraining programs to toughen inexperienced soldiers. Improved logistics management, ensuring depots were better protected and losses minimized. Within months, the U.S. Army in North Africa had transformed from a green, untested force into a hardened and efficient machine. By May 1943, those same troops who had fled at Kasserine helped encircle and destroy Axis forces in Tunisia, capturing over 250,000 prisoners. German realization. German diaries from the period capture the creeping despair. One officer wrote, "We take from the Americans what they abandon, and for a week we fight like giants. Then it is gone, and we are smaller than before. They replenish what they lose in weeks. We never do. I fear we are chasing shadows." Another account from a panzer driver recalled the surreal feeling of fueling his tank from American barrels stamped with U.S. Army markings, knowing full well that the enemy had more waiting over the horizon than he would ever see again. The strategic balance shifts. Kasserine was the high-water mark of German success against U.S. forces in North Africa. The tactical victory disguised a deeper strategic collapse. For every tank Germany captured, America was producing dozens more. For every gallon of gasoline burned, the U.S. pumped thousands of new barrels. The Afrika Korps, still dependent on vulnerable convoys across the Mediterranean, was playing a game whose outcome had already been determined by industrial arithmetic. What Rommel and his officers grasped in 1943 was not merely that the Americans had resources, they had infinite replacement capacity. Germany could win spectacular victories, but each one brought them closer to exhaustion, while their enemy only grew stronger. By late February 1943, the glow of victory at Kasserine had already begun to fade. The Afrika Korps, though proud of its battlefield achievements, was facing an enemy that seemed almost supernatural in its ability to regenerate. The Americans had been humiliated in their first major engagement, yet instead of collapsing, as the Italians often had, they adapted with astonishing speed. Endless supplies, endless soldiers. German field officers were stunned when reconnaissance planes reported fresh American convoys streaming into North Africa just weeks after Kasserine. Dozens of ships unloaded daily at Algerian and Moroccan ports, each carrying tanks, trucks, fuel, and food in quantities the Germans could barely comprehend. At the very moment Rommel's men were siphoning the last drops from captured American barrels, new tank battalions were unloading in Oran. While German mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep a few panzers operational, U.S. factories were rolling hundreds of Shermans off the assembly lines each week. When German soldiers wrote home about gnawing hunger, American POW camps served 3 hot meals a day, even to their captives. The contrast was brutal, and for clear-eyed officers like Rommel and Hildebrandt, it was impossible to ignore. Rommel's growing doubts. By March 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was openly pessimistic. In his diary and letters, he admitted that the war in North Africa was unwinnable. He wrote, "Every tactical success consumes our last resources. Each victory brings us closer to defeat. The Americans have ships, factories, and oil without end. We have courage, but courage is not enough." Rommel even tried to convince Hitler to withdraw German forces from Tunisia to save them for the defense of Europe, but Hitler refused. For the Führer, retreat was unthinkable. For Rommel, fighting on meant slow strangulation. The reality of German logistics. The logistical picture was catastrophic. Fuel. Every drop had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, where Allied bombers and submarines sank nearly half of Axis supply ships by spring 1943. Ammunition. German artillery often rationed shells to a handful per gun per day, while American batteries fired thousands in a single barrage. Replacements. The Afrika Korps was not receiving new divisions, only trickles of men, often poorly trained and lacking equipment. Captured American stockpiles at Kasserine had given a temporary boost, but once consumed, the emptiness of German supply lines became glaringly obvious. The American transformation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army that had crumbled at Kasserine was no longer the same force. General Dwight Eisenhower had implemented sweeping reforms. Commanders like General Lloyd Fredendall were removed and replaced by aggressive leaders like George S. Patton. Training was intensified, discipline tightened, and units drilled relentlessly for combined arms warfare. Logistics, already America's greatest strength, was streamlined to ensure supplies flowed smoothly from ports to the front. The Green Americans of February became the hardened warriors of March and April. They were still learning, but unlike Germany, they could afford mistakes, because behind them stood the world's largest industrial base. German morale erodes. Among German soldiers, a grim realization spread. Letters and diaries reveal their disbelief. One Panzer crewman wrote, "We destroy their tanks, and the next day they bring more. How can one fight such an enemy? They grow stronger as we grow weaker." An infantry officer noted, "We live on American supplies. We fight with fuel from American barrels, yet it is not enough. They have more waiting across the sea. We cannot win." For many, Kasserine marked not just a fleeting triumph, but the first glimpse of inevitable defeat. The strategic tide turns. By the end of March 1943, the Axis position in North Africa had become untenable. Rommel, exhausted and ill, returned to Europe, leaving others to oversee the final collapse. German and Italian troops dug in around Tunisia, but it was clear, the Americans, once mocked as clumsy amateurs, were now a rising giant. The lesson of Kasserine had been learned by both sides. For Germany, it showed that even tactical brilliance could not overcome the crushing arithmetic of industrial war. For America, it was a baptism of fire that forged a modern fighting force. And for history, it was the turning point in the Desert War, where a temporary German triumph revealed the certainty of Axis defeat. By April 1943, the North African campaign had transformed. What began with German triumph at Kasserine had turned into a relentless Allied advance that would trap and annihilate the Afrika Korps. The seeds of this collapse were planted in the very victories that Rommel and Hildebrandt had celebrated just weeks earlier. The aftermath of Kasserine. The battle had given the Germans temporary fuel, ammunition, and equipment. Yet these spoils were a poisoned gift. Each captured American tank or truck only emphasized the scale of resources the United States could afford to lose. German officers realized bitterly that the enemy could abandon entire supply depots and still keep fighting, while the Axis lived shipment to shipment, convoy to convoy. For American forces, the humiliation of Kasserine proved galvanizing. They had suffered 6,500 casualties and lost hundreds of vehicles, but the shock forced a rapid evolution. The U.S. Army learned in weeks what might otherwise have taken years. The rise of George Patton. Into this moment of crisis stepped General George S. Patton, a fiery commander whose arrival transformed the two corps. Patton enforced strict discipline, demanding proper uniforms, polished boots, and rigid obedience. Training intensified, with combined arms maneuvers that welded infantry, armor, and artillery into a cohesive fighting machine. Soldiers, once demoralized, now began to carry themselves with a new sense of pride and purpose. Under Patton, the Americans were no longer stumbling amateurs. They were becoming the modern army that would one day storm Normandy and break the Wehrmacht in France. The Allied machine roars to life. Behind the frontline reforms was the unstoppable momentum of Allied logistics. Convoys crossed the Atlantic in endless streams, pouring supplies into North African ports. By April, the U.S. was deploying over 300,000 men in North Africa, backed by thousands of tanks and planes. British forces under Montgomery pushed from the east after their victory at El Alamein, squeezing Rommel's successors between two massive armies. Air superiority tilted sharply to the Allies, with P-38 Lightnings and Spitfires hunting down German transport planes and cutting off vital supply lines. What had once been a desert battlefield now became a giant trap closing around the Afrika Korps. German desperation. The Germans clung to Tunisia, knowing that if they lost North Africa, the Allies would gain a springboard into Europe itself. Hitler demanded his soldiers fight to the last. But reality on the ground was crushing. Supplies were dwindling to a trickle. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks that had once been the spearhead of Blitzkrieg. Allied bombers pounded ports like Tunis and Bizerta, destroying what little arrived by sea. Troops were exhausted, fighting on half rations while watching Allied soldiers feast on canned meat, chocolate, and bread. Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt, who had once marveled at the American supply dumps at Kasserine, now realized the cruel irony. Germany could never replicate such abundance. The encirclement of Tunis. In April and May, the Allies launched their final offensives. British, American, and Free French forces coordinated massive assaults, driving the Axis steadily back. The Afrika Korps, once masters of maneuver, found themselves pinned into shrinking pockets. By May 7, 1943, Tunis and Bizerta had fallen. Entire German divisions were cut off, their fuel gone, their ammunition nearly exhausted. Soldiers dug into defensive positions, but the overwhelming firepower of Allied artillery and aircraft shattered any hope of holding out. The end of the Afrika Korps. On May 13, 1943, the inevitable happened. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, the largest mass capitulation since Stalingrad. Among them were some of Germany's finest veterans, men who had fought from Tobruk to El Alamein. The surrender marked not just the end of the North African campaign, but the death of Hitler's dream of controlling the Mediterranean. It also revealed the stark truth first glimpsed at Kasserine. Germany could win battles, but it could not win the war against American industry. Legacy of the campaign. The fall of Tunisia was a turning point in World War II. It gave the Allies a base for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. It also signaled to the world that the United States, once derided as a soft nation, was now a military power of unprecedented scale. For the Germans who had reveled in their triumph at Kasserine, the bitter reality had come full circle. They had captured fuel, tanks, and supplies that exceeded their monthly rations. But in the end, all it proved was the futility of fighting against an enemy with limitless reserves. When the guns finally fell silent in Tunisia in May 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian troops trudged into captivity. But beyond the humiliation of surrender, many veterans carried with them a haunting realization. The war had been lost long before the last shot was fired. The shocking contrast. For men like Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt and his Afrika Korps veterans, the war in North Africa had been a brutal education in contrasts. In Germany, fuel was rationed so tightly that divisions received barely enough gasoline to move their tanks a few dozen miles. In North Africa, they had captured 57,000 gallons in a single American dump, more than their division would see in a month. American soldiers lived on rations that seemed luxurious compared to Germany's thin soups and stale bread. Even prisoners captured by the Wehrmacht admitted they had eaten better in training camps than frontline Germans. The message was clear. The United States was a factory nation, fighting with its machines as much as with its soldiers. Prisoner of war camps, a new reality. For many captured Germans, this realization deepened once they reached American POW camps. Here, they found a world unimaginable back home. 3 full meals a day, often exceeding 3,000 calories. Access to books, music, and even classes organized by the U.S. military. Food luxuries, milk, meat, ice cream, Coca-Cola, that their families in Germany had not tasted in years. Veterans who had once believed in Nazi propaganda about decadent democracies now confronted the evidence of American abundance with their own eyes and stomachs. The collapse of the superiority myth. Hitler and Goebbels had long insisted that Germans, as the master race, were tougher, more disciplined, and more resourceful than the soft Americans. Kasserine Pass had briefly seemed to prove this. But what followed destroyed the illusion. Americans could lose hundreds of tanks and replace them in weeks. They could fly endless waves of bombers even after heavy losses. They could feed not only their own population but also millions of soldiers and prisoners without shortages. In private letters, some German POWs admitted the unthinkable. We believed America was weak. Instead, we see it has everything. The psychological blow. This recognition was not just material, it was psychological. German officers, trained to think in terms of logistics, began to grasp the hopeless arithmetic of the war. The U.S. had an industrial output 6 times greater than Germany's. America produced 8 times more fuel than the Reich. For every tank Germany built, the U.S. built 5 to 7. One veteran later recalled, "At Kasserine we thought we had won a victory. But in truth, we had only exposed the scale of the enemy's power. We were fighting against a factory, not an army." Seeds of future change. These experiences sowed seeds that would sprout after the war. Many German POWs repatriated with a new respect for democracy and economic prosperity. They understood that the strength of a nation lay not in slogans or ideology, but in production, logistics, and the well-being of its people. For officers like Hildebrandt, the memory of abandoned American depots became a symbol of futility. A reminder that courage and tactical brilliance could not overcome a nation that could casually leave behind more supplies than Germany could deliver in an entire campaign. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was more than just a clash of armies. It was a revelation about the future of warfare. For the Germans, it was proof that battlefield courage, tactical skill, and even temporary victories could not compensate for the cold mathematics of industrial power. For the Americans, it was a painful but necessary baptism of fire that transformed an inexperienced army into a force capable of crushing the Axis in just 2 years. The German illusion shattered. When Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt's men fueled their panzers with 57,000 gallons of American gasoline, it felt like a triumph. But deep down, officers recognized it for what it was, a borrowed future. They had merely postponed their own collapse by burning the enemy's excess. Once that fuel was gone, they were back to empty tanks, starving supply lines, and impossible demands from Berlin. The Afrika Korps had achieved a tactical victory, but strategically, they had exposed their own doom. The supplies captured at Kasserine were more than Germany could deliver in a month across the Mediterranean. For the Americans, it was simply one depot, quickly replenished. For the Germans, it was an entire campaign's worth of resources, handed to them only once, never again. America learns its first lesson. For the U.S. Army, the defeat at Kasserine was humiliating. Soldiers fled in disarray, supply depots were abandoned, and commanders argued over responsibility. But unlike Germany, America had the luxury of learning through failure. Within weeks, Eisenhower restructured command, giving General Patton authority to reform and harden American forces. Logistics were reorganized so supplies were never again left so vulnerable. Soldiers were retrained under brutal new standards to prepare them for the realities of modern war. By the time of the Tunisian campaign's final battles, those same U.S. forces that had fled at Kasserine stood firm, encircled Axis armies, and forced 250,000 Germans and Italians into surrender. The war beyond the battlefield. Kasserine revealed the essence of modern war. It was no longer decided only by bravery in combat, but by the capacity to sustain losses and recover faster than the enemy. Germany could destroy a tank column, but America could replace it in weeks. Germany could win a tactical battle, but America could win the strategic war. Industrial democracy had become the most powerful weapon of all. It could build Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, produce bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, and generate fuel reserves greater than the Reich could ever dream of. A battle remembered. For Germany, Kasserine was remembered with pride but also bitterness. Soldiers wrote home about the mountains of supplies they had taken, but they also confessed the unsettling truth. The Americans lose more in 1 week than we receive in a year, and yet they replace it. For America, Kasserine became a symbol of transformation. The moment the U.S. Army shed its inexperience and began its march toward becoming a global military power. The ultimate lesson. In the end, Kasserine was not about who captured the most ground or who held the pass. It was about the scale of national power. Germany fought with brilliant generals, disciplined troops, and fierce determination. America fought with factories, oil fields, railroads, and farms. And in modern war, the factory always wins. Rommel, ever the realist, understood this better than most. As he later remarked, "We cannot fight against statistics.